All right, the last subject I want to cover for your exam is the Civil War. And how we're focusing on it is why the North won the Civil War. And if you know nothing else, this part of the class, you have to learn that the North won the Civil War. A word of that hasn't gotten around a lot of these parts yet, particularly Magnolia, but we're here to help. So we're going to go into why it was the North won the Civil War. And we're going to be using things when we look at it that are going to remind you a lot of the American Revolution. That is the first thing I want you all to see is that this is an actual question. This is a event, the American Civil War, that could have gone either way. The South had a legitimate chance of winning it. However, they didn't. And the three things I want you to concentrate on for why they didn't are because of the leadership advantage of the North, the military strategies that the North came up with, and because of the racial divisions of the South. And we're going to go into why those threes are important and are different makers when we get there. But first, let's just start off by a few minutes to connect it to your previous class, the one about the 1850s, and indeed all the classes that led up to this, which is why was there a Civil War in the first place? Nowadays, for some reason, that's a question. That is, you go around, you listen around the country, you have all kinds of people who say the Civil War wasn't fought for slavery, and then they have all kinds of explanations about what it was really about. They're all wrong. The Civil War was fought over slavery. And you don't have to believe me about that. Just go back and ask them. That is, when the southern states announced they were leaving the United States, the various states had to explain why. What you're looking at here is an excerpt from the Ordinance of Secession of the state of Texas. That is, Texas in February of 1861 had delegates meet to try to decide what to do. These delegates suggested that Texas leave the United States and they put that up for a vote. And when they suggested it, they gave a series of reasons, an ordinance explaining why they did it. And if you go down that document, what you'll see is paragraph after paragraph after paragraph about slavery. That is, they talk about every one of the issues that we were discussing in the previous class from the 1850s. Things like the Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott, the uh, Harper's Ferry Revolt. And they're going to put them all into a picture of a plot of abolitionists to destroy slavery and to destroy the slave owners. Right? And they climax with these two paragraphs over here, so let me read them to you. We hold as undeniable truth to the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself, that they're talking about the United States there, were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. Then in this free government, all white men are of and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights. That the servitude of the African race, that is slavery, as existing in these states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator, as it recognized by all Christian nations, while the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, which is the end of slavery, as advocated by our sexual enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both and desolation upon the 15 slaveholding states. By the secession of 6 of the slaveholding states and the certainty that others will speedily do likewise, Texas has no alternative but to remain in an isolated connection with the North or unite her destinies with the South. There is no question that Texas in this document is saying we are leaving the United States because of slavery. We think that the northern states want to get rid of slavery, that they have a plot to get rid of slavery, and we are going to leave in order to save it. And you look at the other states, you will see similar things. And this wasn't just a statement of the leadership. When the or when the it wasn't the legislature, it was a special convention. Once they wrote up this document, they put it for a vote of the white voters of the state. The white voters of the state voted 70 to 30 for secession. That is, it was overwhelming. So what you're seeing here is the consensus, really, of the white population of the southern states. It wasn't a unanimous consensus. There were several. Every southern state is going to wind up, as we shall see, sending in white people to fight for the Union against the Confederacy. But this is the consensus behind the Confederates, their government, and the people who follow them. So you have southern states decide that they need to leave the United States to save slavery, to protect slavery. 11 of these states made that decision. And combined, they got together to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Right? And the Confederate States of America are going to fight a war in order to break away from the United States. Their ultimate goal is independence. The North, fighting against them would be the rest of the United States, the states where slavery was illegal, and four slave states that did not secede: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And looking on the surface, this would look like a lopsided contest because the northern states had a lot of things that they could bring to the table to come in there and defeat the South. They had what I like to call the mattress mac theory of war, which is they had volume, volume, volume. The North had a larger population than the South. They had 17, the northern states had 17 million people. Is it the 1860 census? The Confederate States had 13 million people. Of the 13 million of the South, 4 million were slaves. So effectively, the white population difference was 17 to 9. Why is that a big difference? Because if you're a slave, you are not going to fight for a nation that is fighting to maintain slavery, that is going to fight to keep you enslaved. The portion of the population that would favor the Confederacy in the southern states will be the white population. So they're going to be outnumbered about 2 to 1 by the United States. And this is a significant advantage in a war. Northern armies are always going to be bigger. They can always have people left over at home to grow crops. They can have people at home to work in factories. The South, on the other hand, is going to have a chronic labor shortage, and they're going to be always outnumbered. So the population advantage is one thing that's going to favor the North. Another big advantage that's going to favor the North is going to be production. The North, before the Civil War, remember, was where the factories were built. And if you got factories, you could make weapons. The South is going to be completely dependent on imported weapons. They're going to be fighting largely with English weapons, which makes the North's next advantage very important. The pre war United States Navy came out of here. That is, New England was traditionally the center of sailing. So when the war starts, the boats and the shipyards and the experienced officers and sailors are all in the northern states, or at least are mostly in the northern states. And the North has the productive capacity to make more ships. So the North is always going to control the seas. And within a year of the war, the northern states are going to impose a blockade on the South. That is, they're going to put the Navy off the coast, off the southern coast, and try to stop ships that come into the South. About 2/3 of all ships that try to run the blockade are going to make it. So it sounds on the surface like the blockade wasn't successful. But if you got a blockade like that, the most important part of it is not who they catch, it's who they deter from trying to cross in the first place. Because freight is going to be carried on slow ships. Those slow ships are not going to try to cross the blockade. The blockade runners are going to be fast ships, like drug runners today. They're going to have basically freighters going to places like the Bahamas. They will empty their cargo into small, fast ships. They will try to make it to the southern states and unload their cargo. And about 2/3 of them are going to make it. But they're not going to be able to carry that much cargo. And the cargo they're going to carry are going to primarily be things you can make money on, luxury goods. So the South is going to always have trouble getting war material. They're going to have even more trouble importing food. And they're going to have a lot of trouble exporting cotton. Because remember, cotton was what the South turned into money. So the North is going to have a productive advantage. They're going to have more people. They're going to control the seas. And the North is also going to control the money. Pre war, finance was a Northern thing. We covered this in the class before. The Southerners grew cotton and they purchased financial services from Northern banks, Northern insurance companies. The North before the war built railroad and canal systems. This needed a lot of capital. So they created, as a result, a lot of sophisticated bond markets in order to raise money. California remained with the North. So one of the largest suppliers of gold in the world is in the North. So the North is going to be able to come up with cash in order to fight the war. Even with that, the North strained under the cost of the war. The war is going to cost the United States $6 billion to fight. The pre war gross national product of the United States was $4 billion. So they're going to spend 150% of their gross national product in order to fight the war. They're going to borrow a lot of money. And this is going to strain the northern economy. Prices are going to go up through the war. They're going to have serious inflation. They have to print paper money in order to keep the war going. And this is also going to create inflation. But their economic problems were nothing compared to what the South had. The South had almost no banking system, and what few banks they had and what few gold reserves they had were in New Orleans. To the shock of the world, the U.S. Navy took New Orleans within the first 6 months of the war. So the South basically had no banking system in order to finance the war. They had no hard currency, no gold or silver. So how they paid for the war internally was they printed money. And even there, they didn't even have the printers. They had to go to northern printers to print currency for them. And they had them printing it out the wazoo. Patriotic northern printers then counterfeited that currency. So the South was flooded with paper money that essentially became worthless. Inflation was terrible throughout the South. And by the end of the war, Southerners weren't even taking their own currency. They would only take northern money for goods and services. And the final big advantage that the North would have when going into the volume part of this has to do with agriculture. A lot of you were incorrectly taught that the war was a war of Southern agriculture versus Northern factories. This was a dominant view taught 100 years ago. It isn't true. That is, most people, both North and South, in 1860 worked in agriculture. What was different was what they grew. In the South, the small farmers were owned 50 to 100 acres. They consumed what they needed to survive, and they sold what was left over to the slave owners. In the northern states, the small farmers were more or less the same. But the big farmers in the South were commodity growers. That is, they grew things like tobacco and cotton. In the North, the big farmers grew things like wheat, okay, corn. So you're fighting a war. The northern states are going to be able to produce an unlimited supply of food. The southern states, by contrast, are going to have chronic food shortages. It's ironic that an agricultural region will have difficulty feeding itself, but they were growing crops to sell, okay, cotton, tobacco. They weren't growing crops to eat. An Illinois big farmer was trying to sell to New York, was trying to sell to London, okay, to feed the big populations there, was trying to feed the slaves too. So you have a northern side that has a lot of material advantages to fight with. But the South had some advantages too, and let's go through them. To start off with, the South had a significant diplomatic advantage. The man you're looking at here is Lord Palmerston. Palmerston in 1861 was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Right? United Kingdom in 1861 was the most powerful nation in the world. Okay? It wasn't even close. And Palmerston and a lot of his government were sympathetic to the Confederacy. In France, you saw the same thing. The French government under Napoleon III was openly sympathetic to the Confederacy. Right? So Napoleon III actually approached Palmerston and said, if you recognize Confederate independence, we will too. If you're the South, that is a significant edge if this happens, because the British Navy is more powerful than the American Navy. If the British get involved in the war, then that Union blockade doesn't mean anything anymore. The British have unlimited supplies of money, and they could fund an entire Confederate war effort. They have more factories in the North, so they could wind up producing weaponry for the Confederates. Palmerston in 1861 wasn't ready to commit himself, but a lot of his government was. And if you were the southern states and you could win Palmerston over, push him over the edge, you could conceivably win the war with British help. Right? And while the war is going on, there were enough Confederate sympathizers in Britain that the Confederates were able to raise money in Britain. They were able to buy weapons in Britain. Right? And actually tried to push France and Britain over the top early. In 1861, the Confederate States announced the imposition of something called the cotton embargo. That is, they said they were not going to sell cotton to England or France until England or France recognized their independence. Right? This might have worked, except England and France saw the Civil War coming and stockpiled cotton. So actually, the South missed a chance to sell a lot of cotton and raise a lot of money to pay for the war. But they know the British and French could be convinced. And if they could do it, this could change the war for them. Another advantage that the Confederates had, you could see on this map. The Confederacy is big. That is, if you were a military person in 1861, the most grandiose military adventure you could think of was Napoleon Bonaparte trying to invade Russia. He started with an army of 250,000 men at the Polish border of Russia, marched all the way to Moscow. The adventure was just too big. His armies ran out of food. They were forced to leave Moscow, and by the time he got back to Poland, 80% of his army was gone. It was the symbol of grandiosity. The reason why I'm mentioning that is the distance between the Polish border and Moscow is approximately the same as the distance between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia. So to win the war, not only would the United States have to do the most grandiose military adventure in history, they would have to do it two more times. Right? It was that all the South had to do was keep on fighting. The North had to conquer them. The North had to occupy Southern territory. And could they accomplish this? You don't know, especially since the South had the advantage of being very rugged terrain that did not really have an advanced transportation system. The North was building railroads and canals, which meant the North could move war supplies around, which was good for them. But the South, since they didn't have railroads and canals, was a lot harder to get through. So an invading army would find a lot more difficult to get through the South. So you're the South, you have a big country with rugged terrain. You have potential foreign help that maybe you could talk in off the sidelines. And if you're the South, you have some professionals that you could build a military around. The man you're looking at here is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee in 1860 was the golden boy of the United States Army. And he came into the Army in 1835. He went to West Point, where he graduated #1 in his class. In those days, they made the big, their kind of their best and brightest engineers. So he became a mechanical engineer. In the 1840s, he was one of the principal military commanders in the Mexican War. So he had a lot of experience. After the war, he became head of the Army Corps of Engineers for a while. He was the guy also who led the Marines to put down John Brown at Harper's Ferry. And when the Southern states announced that they were seceding, the American president, Abraham Lincoln, went to him and offered him command of the United States Army to put down the rebellion. Lee said no. Why did Lee say no? Because Lee was from Virginia. His house is actually right across the river from Washington, D.C. If any of you have ever been to Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, if you ever toured the city, that's Robert E. Lee's house. There's a kind of a building in the center of the cemetery. That was Lee's house. That is, his house was confiscated by the U.S. Army when Virginia seceded. It was strategic location, a high ground accessible to Washington, D.C. You big an artillery piece over there, you could blow up the Capitol. Right? So the Union officer, the general who was in command at Lee's house, had his son die during the war. So he said, from now on, I'm going to bury all my dead in Robert E. Lee's yard. And that's actually where Arlington National Cemetery comes from. So Lee decided that he was more loyal to his state than he was to the nation. And I'm mentioning this because Lee wasn't alone. Lee himself was a pretty significant advantage. He was a very good military officer. Okay, he was somebody bold, he was somebody who moved pretty quickly, and he recognized how war was evolving. That is, the big innovation in weaponry before the Civil War was rifles. We mentioned rifles in the American Revolution. Rifles at that time were difficult to use because they were difficult to load. You couldn't load them from the back. The quality of metallurgy wasn't good enough yet, and it took a long time to load them from the front. You still couldn't breech load a gun in 1861, but in the 1850s, a French engineer named Alfred Minet invented a new piece of ammunition called the mini ball. It was shaped like a thimble. It was smaller than the internal circumference of the rifle. However, once the gunpowder detonated, it expanded to fit the interior rifling. So you could now load a rifle as quickly as you could a musket. And that completely changed warfare. And now soldiers were walking around with weapons that were accurate to 300 yards. If you lined up like Napoleon and tried to march forward, you would get chopped to pieces. Lee recognized those changes and adopted his fighting strategies to fit them. If you look at the Confederate armies by the end of the war, they looked like the French army in World War I. That is, they dug trenches in front of them and set up breastworks. They had barbed wire around them. Right? So Lee was a big innovator. He basically invented World War I 50 years before World War I invented World War I. And and the Confederates were brought in a lot of experienced officers like Robert E. Lee. The pre-war U.S. Army was disproportionately Southern. Right? That is, 1/4 of all the officers and non-commissioned officers, that's people like sergeants, in the U.S. Army were Southerners. The reason why had to do with opportunities. Right? Let me give you a counter example to show you what I mean. In the 1840s, a man named of George McClellan went to West Point. Like Lee, he graduated #1 in his class, so likely they made him an engineer. In 1850, though, he quit the Army, okay, in order to become head of the Pennsylvania Railroad. If you were in the northern states, they were building factories, they were building railroads, they were building canals, they were building, right, banks. These were things that all needed educated people. The best college in America was West Point. So if you were a northern officer with some experience with your education, as soon as you served your military commitment, you had a lot of lucrative opportunities out there in the civilian economy. So a typical northern officer would take one of them. If you were a southern officer, though, everything in the South was about slavery. You owned land, you owned slaves. So if you were a middle class kid who ended up going through the army, the only opportunity you had was to stand behind a mule, unless you were able to somehow get capital in order to buy a slave plantation. So those that did not have the money to be slave owners would wind up sticking around the army. They would make a career out of it. It was better than their alternatives. So the South had a core of experienced military men to build an army around. They had potential foreign friends, and they could fight on the fence in a very big, rugged country. Right? So, from this, let us try to figure out a way to compare it. That is, we've gone through a list of northern advantages, we've gone through a list of southern advantages. On your piece of paper, you just have two lists. Now you got to have to figure out a way to make sense of them. And the good way to make sense of it is to put it into the Babu Srinivasan theory of war. Right? It is my theory of war, so I named it after myself, Babu. Right? The Babu Srinivasan theory of war goes like this. In order to win a war, you need two things. You need the ability to fight, you need the will to fight. The ability to fight is you need soldiers, you need weapons, you need money, you need food for your soldiers. You need all the things you need to fight with. The will is the will to pay the price of using it. That is, in soldiers, in war, you're going to have a cost. Your soldiers are going to die. You're going to spend a lot of money. You're going to run into debt. You're going to lose a lot of opportunities. If your side is not willing to pay that price, you cannot win a war. And if we look at the Civil War for what we got so far, we know that the United States has an ability to fight a war. That is, they have more men, they have more factories, they have more money, they have food in order to support them. And there is nothing the South can do about it. The South does not have the power to go north and shut all that stuff down. So if you're the Confederates, the only way you can win the war is by breaking the North's will to fight. If you're in the North, however, you look at your enemy and you see a lot of question marks. They have some ability to fight the war. They have some help from Europe. You don't know if it's enough, and you have a chance to shut down what they already have. You see a Southern leadership that's talking a lot of smack about leaving America, but for all you know, those leaders aren't really speaking for anybody. Remember, the dominant idea in the North in 1860 was the idea of the slave power conspiracy. They thought the Southern states were dominated by a handful of slave owners who were out to spread slavery everywhere. They thought of the typical Southern white person as a victim of this, as somebody who had had their freedom taken away, somebody who was being destroyed by the slave owners. The Northern public expected their army to be greeted as liberators when they went south. They thought that local Southern white people would throw flowers at them. Right? So if that was true, the South would have no will to fight. Even if it was true that most Southerners did not were backing the Confederacy, not all of them were. There were at least a significant minority that wasn't. Every Southern state sent white people to fight for the Union. And even if that was just a small minority, the entire war is going to be fought in the South. It is one thing to talk smack before somebody hits you. It is quite another thing to talk smack when you've been smacked upside the head a few times. So once the war gets bad, once it gets harsh, are the Southerners willing to pay the price of staying in the war? You don't know. So that means you've got a war effort where the South has one way to win the war and the North has multiple ways to win the war. This would seem like it would be a Northern advantage. However, I've showed you this same chart before. That was in the American Revolution. That is, when I drew up this chart for the American Revolution, England was on this side of the chart, the United States was on this side of the chart, and you wound up with a chart that looked exactly the same. Who won that war? And the Confederates made that same analogy. The Confederates looked back at the Revolutionary War and they thought that they were doing a rerun of it. Right? If anything, they had a stronger position than the Americans did in the Revolutionary War. Their potential foreign help, the British, was a lot stronger than the foreigners who helped the United States, the French. Right? The United States did not start the war with a core of a professional military, unlike the Confederates. The United States in 1776, I mean, versus the Confederates in 1861. And the United States military was relatively weak in 1861. The United States Army in 1860 was a grand total of 10,000 men. They were going to need 1.5 million to fight the Civil War. So they aren't going to have a quality advantage over the South, right? Like the British Army had over the Americans in the American Revolution. So an objective observer would look at this and would say the Confederates got a real shot at winning the war. And let me give you something to show you about that. Okay, I put this chart in the wrong place. Sorry about that. In 1863, the Confederate government started selling bonds in Europe in order to raise money in order to buy weapons. Confederate money was worthless. So what the Confederates did in order to get Europeans to buy those bonds was they said that the bonds would be backed with cotton. That is, if they were going to sell a bond for $100, they would give you $100 of cotton in return once the bond came due. Right? Everybody knew what cotton was worth; its value was predictable. And the catch was, in order to get your bond redeemed, you would have to come to Richmond to pick it up, which meant that if you were going to get paid back, the Confederates would have to win the war, right? They started selling these bonds in the fall of 1863. Right? And this is the prices for the bonds they were selling in Amsterdam. They were selling similar bonds in London as well. And in the London bonds, you see a similar result. That is, if you look at it, those cotton bonds were always selling on the European market. As late as the fall of 1864, they were selling for better than 80 cents on the dollar. That is, their price would adjust according to the current war situation. It would go down as the Union had victories, it would go up as the Confederacy had victories. But even as late as the spring of 1860, as the winter of 1865, you were getting those Confederate bonds selling for better than 50 cents on the dollar. The price of those bonds didn't really collapse until the last week of March. The Confederacy, Robert E. Lee's army surrendered in the second week of April. So objective observers, a guy in Europe who had money on the line, would look at the Confederates and say that they had a real shot at winning the war. However, we know from history that they didn't, right? And I want to look at why they didn't. And the three major reasons I want to go into are the ones I mentioned before. The North had leadership that could take advantage of being on this side of the chart, which is a big difference from the American Revolution, right? That is, the British and the American Revolution had George III. The Americans in the Civil War had Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln by himself is going to be a big edge. We'll look at why. The second thing that the United States had in the Civil War was they had a plan. By the end of the war, they're going to develop a strategy called total war. And total war is going to be critical in their final victory. And we'll go over what that is and why it was important. And the final thing they had was they had the advantage of fighting against a racially divided society. And we will go into that at the end of this class. So anyway, let's start off by looking at leadership. If you were an objective observer in 1861 and you were comparing the leaders of the two sides, you would have thought the Confederates would have had an advantage in leadership too. That is, this was the head of the Confederate government. His name was Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis had a pretty distinguished career before 1861. That is, he grew up as a middle class farmer in, I believe, Kentucky. His family actually lived not too far from Abraham Lincoln's wife. Their families knew each other before the war. Like most ambitious middle class people in the South, he joined the Army. He wound up going into West Point, and he graduated as an officer. Once he graduated, he made money the old-fashioned way. He found a rich woman named Verena and married her. And he got rich by managing her plantations. He had owned a plantation called Davis Bend in Mississippi. He was known as a progressive farmer. That is, he kept track of what new stuff was going on in agriculture and applied those to his fields. So Davis was an educated man. He had a formal education. He was successful in business. When the Mexican War broke out, Davis left his plantation and joined the army. And he became an officer under one of the principal military commanders in the Mexican War. The guy's name was Robert E. Lee. That started a connection between Davis and Lee that would become important in the Civil War, too. So Davis was somebody who was successful in business. He was educated. He had military experience. Once the war was over, he ran for the U.S. Senate from Mississippi. Right? And he became the leader of the southern states in the Senate after John C. Calhoun died. Right? So he had experience in Congress, in addition to having military experience, in addition to having business experience, and in addition to having a formal education. In 1856, the Democratic Party won the national elections, and the victorious president, James Buchanan, made Jefferson Davis here the Secretary of War. The Secretary of War was the cabinet agency, the Department of War, that managed the military. So he had not only military experience as a soldier, he had military experience as an administrator. That is, he knew how to run a war department. So if you're are writing a description for who you want to run a country during a war, Davis checked all the boxes. So if you were the Confederacy, you would be pretty optimistic about what he could do. However, he sucked. That is, Davis was a guy with a lot of experience. He was a guy who was pretty smart. The problem was that he knew it. And his experiences, his personality made him very arrogant. He was somebody who didn't listen to anybody. And as a result, he tended to alienate everyone. And that is a very bad thing if you are the president of the Confederacy, because the Confederate Constitution made the office of the presidency pretty weak. In order to get anything done, he had to convince a lot of people to follow him. That is, he had to convince state governors to give up resources. He had to convince the Confederate Congress to go along with him. And Davis instead spent all of his time feuding with these people. Right? For example, the state of North Carolina had shoes. Okay? The Confederate Army in Virginia went barefoot. So it would stand to reason you get the shoes out of the warehouse in North Carolina, you give them to the soldiers in Virginia. Howard, the governor of North Carolina, said, those shoes are for North Carolina people only. A good politician would have been able to talk to him, gotten the shoes. However, Davis was not a good politician. He and the governor of North Carolina, his name was Joe Brown, hated each other. So if he wasn't going to give shoes to the army before, Joe Brown definitely wasn't going to do any favors for Jefferson Davis. On and on, you see things like that. Davis had 8 separate secretaries of war during the Civil War. The Civil War only went on for 4 years. If you look at the history of the Confederate Army, it is a series of feuds between Jefferson Davis and every general in the Confederate Army except Robert E. Lee. He thought he knew their job better than they did. Right? So Davis would be a net negative for the Confederate war effort. But that isn't all that big of a deal, because remember what the position the Confederates are in. Their only opportunity to win the war is by wearing the Union Army out, by wearing the United States out, by dragging the war on long enough that the Americans just quit. They say, screw it, we could be in this war for forever. The South just isn't worth it to us. And no matter how bad the Confederate government was, it was going to execute that plan. And it's like going back to the American Revolution again. The American Continental Congress, remember, the American Revolution was notoriously corrupt and ineffective. It won the war anyway because it had the one button theory. If you only have one button, you can't press the wrong one. The North, on the other hand, had this guy in charge. His name was Abraham Lincoln. If you were sitting around in 1861, you would not have been particularly impressed by Abraham Lincoln. Right? Abraham Lincoln, let me give you Abraham Lincoln's resume in 1861. He was born to a middle class family in Kentucky, about 50 miles from Jefferson Davis's birth. His family, though, crossed the river, went into Indiana and Illinois, where he grew up on a farm and got no formal education. Right? So eventually he would get a book and teach himself how to read. After that, he became a lawyer. How can you become a lawyer if you never went to school? Well, he got a law book, read it, and took the bar exam. You could do that in 1830 or 40. And that is, at that time, they had most states had very loose requirements over licensing. Okay? They thought that things like licenses, the necessity to prove you were competent at what you were doing, as undemocratic. So the only thing you needed to be a doctor in 1840 in most states was a sign that said doctor. Right? Lincoln's total military experience was he led a group of Illinois militia into something called the Black Hawk War. In the Black Hawk War, just a bunch of drunks in the Illinois militia massacred a bunch of Indians. Lincoln's guys got so drunk they missed the massacre. His total political experience was he was elected to Congress in 1844. He was defeated when he ran for re-election in 1846. So the rest of his experience in Congress was, in politics, was in the Illinois legislature. The only reason he was president was because the Republican Party in 1860 figured they could nominate a dead cat and win the election. The only way they could lose the election was if their candidate just made too many enemies. And they figured all the prominent leaders in the Republican Party all had made too many enemies in the 1850s. Lincoln, on the other hand, was somebody who was a relative unknown. So they made him president because he seemed like a safe choice. So if you were an objective observer looking around in 1861, you would have real questions that this guy Lincoln had what it took in order to lead a war effort. But as it turns out, looks were deceiving. That is, Lincoln was even pretty funny looking. At a time when the average man was 5'7", he was 6'5". He had he weighed 175 pounds, so he was pretty thin. He had a genetic deformity that inflated his hands, so he had hands the size of hams. Right. So you've got a guy who is of no background, who doesn't even particularly look like a leader. Right? However, the United States got lucky. Lincoln was one of the great politicians in history, one of the great war leaders in history. And he knew what he wanted, and he was somebody smart enough to recognize all of his opportunities and use them in order to be able to get what he wanted. Right? And he is going to play a strong role in getting the United States to win the war. Right? And let's go over a little bit of his background before I give you an example of this. Lincoln was somebody who had a lot more to the table than would meet the eye. That is, like I said, he had no formal education, but the guy taught himself how to read. Okay? That's a pretty significant achievement. He is the only American president who actually has a patent on file. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington had invented machines, but they did so before the United States had a patent office. Lincoln, however, devised a machine that would take a barge out of a canal and turn it around so it could go the other direction. I don't know if anybody bought it, but it's still on file. He was also somebody who was kind of a straight shooter. That is, in his time in Congress in 1844, in those days, Congress was notorious for spending its time drinking and whoring. When Lincoln was in Congress, though, he spent all of his time at the Library of Congress reading the books. Right? That is, although he was from Illinois, he kind of had the background of a lot of New England people. That is a mentality. That is, he lived in a world that saw itself reinventing the world, that they thought that the world was perfectible. So he and a lot of individuals try to do that with themselves. That is, they try to make themselves better than their background. And Lincoln did that by trying to educate himself and also by developing a sense of kind of an idea of what the world should be. That is, he got a sense of right and wrong, and he thought that getting the right built into the world was something that was possible. So he was going to make himself do it. And he had a strong vision of where he wanted to take the world and take himself. And let's go through and see how that makes a difference, how what Lincoln's bringing to the table will make a difference in the war. And let's do that by looking at the specific example of slavery. Right? We go back to a map over here. When the war started, that is when the shooting broke out in 1861, slaves voted with their feet. That is, a number of slaves took advantage of the war to escape from their owners and made their way to U.S. Army lines. Right? Officers in the United States Army didn't know what to do because military law said that they were supposed to send the slaves back to their masters. That is, military law treated an escaped slave like a runaway horse. It is property that should be returned to its rightful owner. However, a lot of the officers in the army, okay, were true believers. That is, the North had a significant part of the population that was opposed to slavery. We'll go more into that in a minute. So they didn't want to send slaves back. Others were people who were politically ambitious, who saw a angle in keeping slaves from being returned and saw it politically bad to send them back. So officers, no matter what they thought, wanted to cover their ass. So they wanted the government to give them orders over what to do. Right? So Lincoln and Washington kept on getting requests from officers in the field for some kind of a statement over whether to send those slaves back. Lincoln never replied. This went on for 1861. Fast forward to 1862. A senator named James Fessenden comes into Lincoln's office in the Oval Office and talks to him. The Republican Party of the United States was deeply divided over slavery. The entire Northern public was. That is one of the big myths, looking backward, was that the North was opposed to slavery and fought the Civil War to end slavery. This isn't true. The United States fought the Civil War because the South seceded. The American public, the consensus of them, saw this as an act of a conspiracy, the slave power conspiracy, a conspiracy that was plotting to make everybody but themselves a slave, regardless of race. They figured breaking the country apart was the first step in this conspiracy. Destroy the greatest democracy in the world, and then once they have established themselves, to come back in and try to enslave people again. Right? Anyway, so although the Republican Party was united behind the idea of fighting this conspiracy, they were not united at all about slavery. That is, non-Republicans in the North didn't even believe in the conspiracy. A lot of them wanted to negotiate with the South a way to an end to the war, a negotiations that would guarantee the future of slavery in America. Among the Republicans, one faction of Republicans wanted the war to be strictly about reuniting the Union. They did not want the war to be about slavery. These guys were, okay, to a certain extent, racist. That is, there was a lot of racism in the northern states. They were people who thought that the end of slavery would be unpopular. That is, slaves, if slavery was over, would come to the North and compete for jobs with white people. Right? There were others in the North, though, who were morally opposed to slavery. They want to take advantage of the war to end it. So Lincoln was facing a divided population. And he was divided even among his supporters. So in that context, James Fessenden comes in to talk to him. Fessenden was part of the faction that did not want the Civil War to be about slavery. He wanted it to be strictly about keeping the country together. So Fessenden came in to Lincoln and told him, whatever you do, do not make this a war about slavery. We'll lose the war. We'll tear the North apart. Lincoln looked him straight in the eye and said, if I could win this war without freeing a single slave, I would do it. Fessenden walked away happy. But what Lincoln didn't tell Fessenden was locked in this desk. This, by the way, was Lincoln's desk. He was 6'5", like I said, in a time when the average man was 5'7". So all the furniture of the era looked like doll furniture to him. But locked in that desk was this piece of paper. This is Lincoln's handwritten first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the United States. So what had Lincoln just done to Fessenden? He lied to him. Right? That is, they call him Honest Abe. That is not true. Lincoln was a politician and a very good one, meaning that he not only would lie, he was pretty good at it. But the question here is, why would he lie to Fessenden? And why did the previous year he spend all his time avoiding doing anything about slavery? Right? Especially that part about lying to Fessenden, because he lied to him about something that's really big, the end of slavery. As soon as he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, Fessenden's going to know that Lincoln was bullshitting him. So let's go through Lincoln's thinking to see what all of this was about. Let's first start off with, did Lincoln have an opinion about slavery? That is, you have a Republican Party divided between those who didn't want to end slavery and those who did. Was Lincoln take a stand on that? And the answer to that is definitely yes. Lincoln was somebody who was morally opposed to slavery. You look at his writings from before the war, that is pretty clear. He thought slavery was wrong and he wanted to use his opportunity as president to end slavery. But he concluded that only meant anything if the Union won the war. That is, if the North didn't win the war, it didn't matter what he would say, the slaves would be slaves anyway. Right? So, with that in mind, let's look at his actions. In 1861, the first year of the war, the main thing he was worried about was this state over here, Kentucky. Kentucky was the largest of the slave states that didn't secede. It is the state in the United States. And Kentucky had a strategic location. It was just south of the Ohio River. Okay? So if Kentucky went with the Confederacy, that meant the Confederates could now get 1 million more people into their population. Right? They had more soldiers to fight with. And they could now defend from the Ohio River south. They would have a moat in front of them. Right? If Kentucky, on the other hand, stayed in the Union, then the Confederates were in a much more difficult position. That is, their manpower disadvantage was even more amplified. And this area over here in the West was pretty much undefensible. A Union army from Kentucky can come straight into it. Right? So Lincoln wanted to make sure that Kentucky stayed in the Union, which was why he was deliberately remaining silent about what to do about slave refugees making their way to the U.S. Army. He didn't want to say anything that would spook Kentucky. Right? And from his background, that is, he knew a lot of people in Kentucky, and from his wife's family was prominent in Kentucky. He knew Kentucky politics, so he was working Kentucky pretty hard and buying time over slavery while that was going on. By 1862, Lincoln is pretty sure that Kentucky will stay in the Union. But in the summer of 1862, he has a different problem. The different problem is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee took command of the Confederate Army in June of 1862. And between June and when Lincoln talked to Fessenden, Lee won a lot of spectacular victories. So when Lincoln talked to Fessenden, Lincoln was afraid that if he issued a stand against slavery at that moment, it would be seen around the world as an act of weakness. And as an act of weakness, it would harm the Union war effort. Right? Because he saw three audiences that would be listening to him. One audience was Europe. Right? That is, in places like England, they were trying to decide what to do about the Civil War. He was afraid that if the government saw him making a statement out of weakness, they, for one thing, would say he wasn't sincere, that he did not have any real desire to end slavery. So it wouldn't help him with anti slavery people in England. On the other hand, that faction in England that did want to intervene in the Civil War would smell blood. They would see weakness. They would say that Lincoln is grasping at straws. The Northern war position must be worse than it looks on. So this is the time to get off the sidelines. Let's cut a deal with the Confederacy and win over their loyalty by giving them help now. Right? So if he made a move against slavery from weakness, he figured that the British and the other Europeans would act accordingly, that it would harm the war effort there. The second audience would be the Northern public. The Northern public, remember, was divided between people who opposed slavery and people who didn't want the war to be about slavery. Lincoln figured if the proclamation was made from a sign of weakness, that it would hurt him among both. That is, that the anti slavery people wouldn't take it seriously, and the people who didn't want the war about slavery would be enraged. And worse, the public as a whole, if they saw this coming from weakness, would think that the war was going worse than the government was leading on. And if they think the war is going worse than the government is leading on, then they will lose their will to continue the war. And remember what the big weakness the United States has. If the Confederates are going to win that war, they're going to break the American will to keep the war going. So he figured if people see weakness in the statements, that this would hurt the war effort in England, it would hurt the war effort in the North. He also thought it would hurt the war effort in the South, right? Because if the South sees a statement against slavery, they're going to be enraged. Remember, they're fighting the war to keep slaves. They're going to see it as an invitation to a slave revolt, right? A chance to kill all the white people. So making a statement against slavery would be a shot in the arm to the Confederate morale. It would make them even more determined to fight. But also, they would see this as an act of weakness. So they could say, you know, we're closer to winning the war than we thought. All we got to do is push a little hard and just keep on going, and the war will end, and we will get what we want. So Lincoln, when he was talking to Fessenden, had reached that conclusion. That is, if he gave a statement against slavery and it was interpreted as a sign of weakness, that is, it was given after a series of Confederate victories, then it would harm the Union's war effort. He, however, thought that all that would change if he issued that statement from a position of strength. That is, if the North won a battle, then everybody would look at the situation differently. Right? The proclamation would have a completely different meaning in Europe, in the North, in the South. So he kept the Emancipation Proclamation locked up in his desk and waited for a Union Army victory. The victory came in September at a place called Antietam in Maryland. Right? In September 1862, Robert E. Lee was kind of at his high point. He took his army across the Pacific River into Maryland. Maryland was Union occupied territory. Maryland was a slave state. A lot of Marylanders supported the Confederacy, but Lincoln essentially put it under martial law, arrested anybody in the Maryland government who supported secession, and kept a lot of troops there to keep Maryland in line. So when Lee crossed the Potomac into Maryland, this was the first time really the Confederates went on the offensive. Lee went there, Maryland, by the way, because he had a lot of horses in his army. And his horses had eaten by then every blade of grass in Northern Virginia. So he was going to Maryland in order to feed his horses. Right? So his army crossed the Potomac into Maryland. After his army crossed, a Union Army soldier marched through a field where the Confederates had been before. And while he was walking through that field, he was looking and he saw a piece of paper lying on the ground. So that soldier said, "Cool, toilet paper." And that was the America of 1862, has a lot in common with the America of the coronavirus. Anyway, so he picked up this piece of paper and he saw that the paper was wrapped around something. So he unwrapped it and saw that it was wrapped around a bunch of cigars. So he thought, this is my lucky day. Not only do I got toilet paper, I got cigars. But then he took a closer look at the paper. Turns out that paper was a map. It was a map of where Robert E. Lee was taking his entire army. It was a detailed map of all the Confederate positions planned for the next day. So the soldier said, you know, there are probably better things I could do with this than shove it up my ass. Right? So he sent it up his chain of command. It went to the top, the commanding general of the Union Army, a guy named George McClellan. McClellan was such an idiot that he still almost lost the battle anyway. However, he did enough that the newspapers were convinced that this was a Northern victory. It was a costly one. It was the bloodiest day in American history in terms of casualties on both sides. But the Northern newspapers, the newspapers in Europe said the Northern Army won a battle. As soon as that word came out, Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation issued. And it had a completely different impact by waiting for this victory. Right? Let's look at the three audiences that he has in mind. First audience is the Europe. In Europe, people who were anti-slavery took the Emancipation Proclamation very seriously. And as such, the British government found that politically they could not recognize the Confederacy. It was never really seriously considered after that. That is, the British public was just too anti-slavery to be involved in a war to protect slavery. Right? So by waiting till a victory, Lincoln was able to eliminate one of the major threats to the Union, the idea that Europeans would intervene in the war and help the Confederates win. Second major audience he was talking to was the Northern public. By waiting for a victory, the Northern public took Lincoln seriously. They thought that he issued the proclamation because he really meant it and intended to follow through on it. So anti slavery people were energized by it. There was a wave of enlistments in New England, especially, into the army to help fight the crusade against slavery. There were enough enlistments coming into the army that the North was able to put off conscription, that is, drafting people into the army, for another year. In the South, they had to start conscription in August of 1862. Right? Even among those who were opposed to making the war about slavery, a number of them respected that Lincoln acted from strength. That is, they interpreted what Lincoln did as punishing the Confederates, showing them what was in it for them if they tried to destroy the Union. Right? So a net negative, if he acted from weakness, is a net positive among his position in the North by acting from strength. The final audience is the Confederacy. Right? And it's interesting how he phrased the Emancipation Proclamation to see what he was trying to do with the Confederates. The language of the Emancipation Proclamation says it would only take effect on January the 1st, 1863. And it would only take effect in areas that on January 1st, 1863 were under Confederate control. That is, areas that had slavery but were under Union control, such as places like Maryland, Kentucky, or occupied parts of Virginia and Louisiana, would keep slaves. So the only slaves that would be freed by the Emancipation Proclamation were slaves who were outside of the reach of the Union Army to free them. That's why a lot of people in the future would say that the Emancipation Proclamation was a fraud, that it didn't free a single slave. But that's not exactly true. Right? The Emancipation Proclamation should be looked more for the commitment behind it. Right? Because before the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States could end the war and declare victory as long as the southern states were still part of the United States. They could have slavery and everything would be good. Now, however, with the Emancipation Proclamation, if the war ended without and slavery is still in the United States, then the war was a failure. Right? So by doing this, Lincoln is committing the country to a war effort that will ultimately end in the end of slavery. The war cannot end without slavery being ended. And he's sending a message to the Confederates, right? That is, you want to keep this war going, I'm upping the stakes. You've got 3 months to negotiate an end of the war with me. That is, between now and January the 1st, maybe we can cut a deal where you can come back into the United States and be able to keep slavery. But if you drag on this war any longer than that, then you are losing slaves. And I remember what was the one thing the Confederate States wanted more than anything else? They wanted to maintain slavery. Right? So by waiting for a Northern victory, he has completely changed the dynamic among everybody. He makes it harder for the Europeans to intervene in the war. He gains enthusiasm for the Northern war effort, and he demoralizes the South. Okay? He is putting a lot of pressure on them to come to a quick conclusion to the war and promising them that if they don't take it, that the war is going to be very harsh for them, that the one thing they want more than anything else is going to be taken away from them. And Lincoln is going to make decisions like this over and over again during the war. That is, he is going to think things through. And that is something that is absolutely essential if you are on this side of the chart. Having multiple options is bad if you're an idiot. That is, if you're weak and indecisive, you will just if you have something like that, you'll do one thing just long enough to make sure that other options won't work, and then you won't follow through on that plan either. But if you are smart, okay, if you are a good leader, then having multiple options means you could come up with the quickest, most efficient plan to win. And you can come up with the plan that best shapes the world you want after you win. Right? So Lincoln's leadership was going to be very important in that Union victory and in the United States that is going to wind up emerging from the Civil War. And Lincoln and the United States had other things going for them too. That is, the United States had a plan to win the war. It was called Total War. Total War is the brainchild of three people. One was Abraham Lincoln. That is, he didn't have any military experience, but he intuited the way that the war was evolving. That is, he had a kind of inarticulate understanding of what should be done. He just couldn't find a general that would tell it to him until he ran into this guy here. His name is U.S. Grant. Right? Ulysses S. Grant and his second in command, William Tecumseh Sherman. Grant, Sherman, and Lincoln are going to put together a plan called Total War. And Total War is going to be a key to the victory of the United States in the Civil War. And let me give you a little bit of background on it. Right? I'll start by going over who Grant and Sherman were. Okay? Grant and Sherman do not look like generals. They look like mean drunks. If you go under Highway 249, you find guys that look like Grant and Sherman, right? As opposed to Robert E. Lee, who looked like a general. That was because Grant and Sherman had different backgrounds. That is, both Grant and Sherman went to West Point. They were both middle class people, saw West Point as a way up. However, Grant did not graduate number one in his class. He graduated actually towards the bottom. So actually, he was in West Point the same time Robert E. Lee was. They didn't know each other because Lee was the golden boy and U.S. Grant over here was just another guy. So once he was out of West Point, Grant became a junior officer. In the Mexican War, while Lee was a general, Grant was commanded a mule train in Mexico. That is, the U.S. Army went through Mexico, so he commanded a train of mules that pulled wagons that brought supplies from the United States to the Army, which ironically meant he had more combat experience than Robert E. Lee did, because the most dangerous place to be in Mexico was on a mule train. Because remember, this was a guerrilla war, and the guerrillas constantly tried to ambush supply columns. It was kind of like if you were in Afghanistan. The most dangerous place to be in Afghanistan was behind the wheel of a truck, right? So Grant had service in the Mexican War. It was service that didn't make him famous. And once the war was over, he was out of the Army. He then went to Galena, Illinois, and bought a grocery store. And his store went broke because he drank all the profits. And that is one of the reasons why he looked like a mean drunk was because he was. Sherman's experience before the Civil War wasn't a whole lot better. In 1861, Sherman was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was the commandant of the Louisiana Military Academy, what would eventually become LSU. And that's not something LSU really brags about today. Right? So Grant and Sherman before the war were undistinguished officers. However, once the Civil War started, the United States Army expanded from 10,000 men to 1.5 million. So the United States Army was desperate for officers, especially since a disproportionate amount of the experienced officers were Southerners and went south with the Confederates. Right? So anybody with military experience could get a commission in the new United States Army. So Grant and Sherman joined up. They both got commissions in the Illinois State Militia. I get the map over here. Being in the Illinois Militia, Illinois is right over here, they fought on the western front of the Civil War. That is, you have a chain of mountains going through here, the Appalachians. There were two major battlefields. There was the Eastern Front, which is primarily Virginia, and the Western Front, which was over here, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama. The Virginia Front was the glamour front. So if you were an officer with political connections, if you were somebody who could generate media exposure, you looked to get yourself a commission over here. The Western Front was the front that nobody paid any attention to, right? So we got the officers who were left over, the guys who didn't have political connections. And the Western Front, as a result, became a meritocracy. Right? That is, it was a Darwinian struggle for survival. You got command of troops. You took them out to combat. If you won, you got promoted. If you lost, you went home. Grant and Sherman both won, so they worked their way up the chain. By 1862, Grant is on command of all the American armies in the West. Right? He is ambushed at a place in Tennessee called Shiloh, suffers a lot of casualties, but wins the battle. Right? So he keeps command. The following year, in 1863, he took his army into Mississippi, where he laid siege to the town of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the last outpost on the Mississippi River that the Confederates controlled. On July the 4th, 1864, Vicksburg surrendered, and the entire Mississippi River was under Union control. That made U.S. Grant a national hero. So Lincoln, who by this point had gone through a number of generals in charge of the army, fired the one that he had and put U.S. Grant in charge of all the armies of the United States. Grant then promoted Sherman to replace him as commander of the armies of the West. And together, Grant and Sherman, over the summer of 1863, came up with a plan that they were going to use to shape the war around for the next couple of years. They called it total war. They sent this plan up to Lincoln. Lincoln read it and said, "Damn it, I've been waiting 2 years for somebody to tell me this." Let's go over what the plan was. Grant and Sherman said that people were looking at war wrong. People were looking at war like a football game. That is, two armies just went into a field, they would fight, one would win, one would lose, the end. Instead, Grant and Sherman said that war should be looked at not as armies fighting, but as societies fighting. That if the North wanted to win the Civil War, they had to destroy the entire society of the South. Not only did they have to defeat its armies and take territory, they had to destroy the productive capacity of the South in order to keep the war going. Right? And let me give you an example for how this worked. The example was Sherman's march to the sea. Okay? Sherman, when he took command of the armies of the West, was able to take control of Tennessee and in the summer of 1864 attacked Atlanta, Georgia. The commander in Atlanta, Confederate commander in Atlanta, was a guy named Joseph Johnston. Joseph Johnston was one of the many generals who feuded with Jefferson Davis. So while the battle was going on, something big happened. So let me give you a little context for it. Johnston's plan for defending Atlanta was to dig a bunch of trenches around Atlanta and basically fight it like eventually World War I would be fought. He put his men into trenches and had them stand in the trenches and shoot at the invading army and try to hold them off. This was a plan that was working. That is, once Sherman got to Atlanta, his progress was stopped. However, in the middle of the battle, Jefferson Davis fired Joseph Johnston. That is, he was feuding with him. He didn't like him. He thought he knew war better than Joseph Johnston did. So he replaced Johnston with a general named John Bell Hood. Hood decided that the smart thing to do was to take his men out of trenches and launch a frontal assault against an enemy that outnumbered him. Apparently, when Sherman saw the Southern Army coming, he started laughing because he couldn't believe they would do something that stupid. Hood got his army chopped to pieces, and so they were forced to withdraw from Atlanta. So in September of 1864, Sherman took Atlanta. By the way, this could arguably be the most important event of the entire war because elections were coming up in November, and Lincoln was afraid he was going to lose the elections. However, the victory in Atlanta showed the Northern public that progress was being made, so Lincoln was able to win his reelection. Had Johnston stayed in command in Atlanta and be able to drag out the defense past the election, which would have been a couple of months away, it's possible that the Civil War would have had an entirely different result. Anyway, once Sherman takes Atlanta, in the winter he then ordered his men to form 250-mile wide columns. And he orders those two columns to march from Atlanta to Savannah on the Atlantic coast. And while they're marching, he told his men to use anything that they needed from the countryside, to live off the land. So as they marched through farms, if the farms had livestock they wanted to eat, kill the livestock, slaughter it, eat it. If the if the fields had crops they wanted to eat, to go ahead and eat the crops. If there was a bridge they needed to use the bridge. If there was a railroad they needed to use the railroad. He then told his men if they found anything useful that they couldn't use, to destroy it. So they found livestock that they didn't want to eat, they were going to kill the livestock. If they found crops that they didn't want to eat, they would burn them down. If they found a bridge that they didn't need to use, they would chop it up. Here is Sherman's army running into a railroad they didn't need. Why do this? Let's look at the chart. Remember, if you are the Confederates and you want to fight a war, you need two things. You need an ability to fight and a will to fight. So if Sherman is going to destroy everything the Confederates can use to fight the war with, he is destroying their ability to fight. Right? That is, he knew that the Confederacy was huge. He only had a limited number of men to occupy it. The same problem the British had in the Revolution, the same problem the Americans had in Iraq or Afghanistan. So he knew he wasn't going to be in Georgia long. So what he was going to do is, before he left, he was going to destroy anything useful for the Confederate war effort. They could come back into Georgia if they wanted, but they wouldn't be able to use it for anything. Right? So by doing this total war strategy, you are destroying the ability of your enemy to keep the war going. But also he figured this destroyed the enemy's will. Because after all, put yourself in the position of a private from Georgia who was in the army in Virginia. Right? You're getting letters from home. First letter says, I've heard rumors that Sherman's army is coming. Second letter says, Sherman's army is 10 miles down the road. They've destroyed the bridge that leads here. Third letter, Sherman's army is here. They're destroying everything. Come home. If you were the soldier reading that letter, what would you do? And what turned out to happen was, in the last 6 months of the war, the Confederate army was flooded with deserters. That is, soldiers who were terrified or worried about what was going on at home abandoned their posts and went back to their homes. And their will to continue the war was broken. So total war is an effective strategy to fight a war. Okay? It was one that was used all over the battlefields, both in the East and the West, in 1864 and 65. And it ended with the destruction of the Confederate armies and the destruction of their ability to keep the war going on any longer. And essentially, this doctrine, total war, became the doctrine of the American army and the American armed forces for the next 100 years afterwards. Right? And if you follow World War II, this was the strategy of the nations in World War II. So if Robert E. Lee invented World War I to fight the Civil War, Grant and Sherman invented World War II in order to beat them. So you come into April of 1865, the Confederate armies are smashed. They are overrun with desertions. One by one, they surrender because they cannot effectively fight anymore. And the Civil War is over, the end. Except, if there have been plenty of people in the history of the world who have been beat worse than this, but came back for more. For example, if you have any Irish heritage, let me give you the 60-second history of Ireland. In the 1500s, England sent an army to Ireland and conquered the island. The Irish rebelled against them, and the English crushed them. Then 30 years later, the Irish rebelled again, and the English crushed them. Then the Irish rebelled again, then the English crushed them. Then the Irish rebelled again, then the English crushed them. Then the Irish rebelled, then the English crushed them. Then the Irish rebelled, then the English crushed them. Then there was a famine. Then the Irish rebelled, and the English crushed them. Then the Irish rebelled, and the English crushed them. Finally, in 1916, the Irish rebel one more time. This time they win. That's 500 years worth of hate. Okay? Why go into that? Well, Charlie Daniels once wrote a song, "The South Shall Rise Again." It's been 150 years, they ain't done it yet. Right? That is Ireland, Palestine. They were all beat worse than this. They all look to continue the war. And remember, if you are the Confederates, your target is the enemy's will to fight. This can be broken even with the Confederate armies destroyed. Just go into the forest, go into the mountains, launch a guerrilla campaign, keep on fighting until the other side gives up. So why couldn't the Confederates do that? And that goes to the last advantage the Union had that I want you to recognize. And that was that the Confederates were a racially divided society. When people talk about the South, what they really are talking about are white people. They use Southern white and Southern as interchangeable. Remember, 1/3 of the population of the South in 1861 were black. Right? 90% of those blacks were slaves. And this is a war being fought to preserve slavery. So if you are one of these black people, you have zero incentive for the Confederates to win. And you have a lot of incentives to make sure the Union wins. As the war went on, blacks took the opportunity of the chaos of the war to escape. Right? They made their way to Union lines. Thousands of them joined the Union Army. Actually, over 100,000 did by the end of the war. Right? Thousands more joined the Union Navy. Right? So you had men from the Civil War with a lot of black people with a lot of military experience. And with that in mind, let's look at how this limits what the South can do. There was no way that the South could launch a guerrilla campaign because if they left settled areas behind, went into the woods, went into the mountains, there's no way that they could continue slavery. The slaves aren't going to voluntarily stay enslaved. As soon as the force to keep them down is gone, they are going to rise up. They are going to wind up getting their freedom. Right? And even if they think losing slaves is worth the price of continuing a guerrilla war, if a demoralized Northern army winds up leaving the South, they can always say before they leave, go up to the former slaves, hand them their rifles, and say, "Here you go, my brother, go to town." That is, in a racially divided society, the white population of the South was more afraid of blacks than they were of the Northern nation. Remember how they were thinking of things. They were thinking that there was no position in the United States for a black except as an inferior, as a dependent. That having blacks as not slaves, as having them as equals, would lead to the desolation of the states and the inevitable destruction of Southern white people. So if you're in that situation, if you're a Southern white person who is that afraid of blacks, then what can you protect you from them? The only thing that can is that Northern white government. As long as the Northern government is there, okay, you are protected from what the slaves can do. If the slaves want revenge, they can't get it. So then this is something that wasn't true in other places. For example, when the United States went into Japan and Germany at the end of World War II, they went in with similarly divided populations. The German and Japanese leaderships were terrified that their populations would blame them for starting the war and look to get even, turn to the communists, put all of their old leaders in front of a firing squad. The only thing that could prevent that, they figured, was the American occupation, so they cooperated with it. If you looked at, say, Iraq, though, or Afghanistan, the rebels did not see it that way. They did not see that if the Americans weren't around, they were going to get destroyed. They saw that if the Americans weren't around, right, they would get what they wanted. So the United States was unable to keep them under control, right? Or was unable to develop strategies which would appeal to the divisions of the population in Afghanistan or Iraq in order to make them support the American government. So by combining this, having a racially divided society with their strategy and their leadership, the United States was able to take advantage of everything else. That is, they were able to take this chart and turn it into a W. Something that many nations in history haven't done. Actually, most nations in this position don't, but they were able to do it. And that's the last thing I want to cover for this semester. So if you have any questions over this, let me know. I will put the exam up shortly.